A president stands at a podium in Beijing and announces billions more for Africa. Cameras flash, delegations applaud. Headlines call it generosity. But look closer, and the story isn't really about aid at all. It's about ownership. Since the year 2000, Chinese lenders have signed more than 1,300 loan deals with African governments. Together, they add up to over $180 billion. That's according to researchers at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, who have tracked every one of these deals for more than 2 decades. Not gifts, loans, and loans always come with terms. At the 2024 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit in Beijing, President Xi Jinping stood in front of more than 50 African heads of state and pledged another $50 billion over 3 years, roughly $30 billion in loans, $11 billion in grants and aid, the rest funneled toward investment China hoped its own companies would make. It sounded like a gift. But every dollar of it was a bet, and China doesn't place bets it expects to lose. Most of this started in earnest after 2013, when Beijing launched its Belt and Road Initiative, a global infrastructure push stretching from Southeast Asia to East Africa to South America. Africa became one of its biggest testing grounds. The pitch was straightforward. African nations needed roads, railways, and power grids they couldn't easily finance themselves. China had state banks willing to lend, state companies hungry for contracts, and a surplus of steel, cement, and cheap credit. For a continent long used to slow-moving Western aid programs and strict conditions attached to every dollar, fast Chinese money looked like an easy answer. So what has Africa actually gotten for all that money? Roads, railways, power lines, ports, phone networks. In Ethiopia, the China Export-Import Bank lent nearly $2.5 billion to build the Addis Ababa to Djibouti Railway, Africa's first fully electrified cross-border line, constructed by China Railway Group and China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation. It cut a journey that once took days by road down to about 12 hours by rail. In Kenya, Chinese financing built the standard gauge railway connecting the coast to the capital. In Nigeria, the China Harbour Engineering Company built the Lekki deep sea port outside Lagos, with loans from the China Development Bank covering most of the cost. In exchange, the Chinese company didn't just get repaid, it took a majority stake in the port itself, 54%. That single number tells you everything about how these deals actually work. China isn't just lending money and walking away, it's becoming an owner. Today, Chinese firms operate in 78 ports across 32 African countries. That's more than a third of every commercial port on the continent. In Cameroon's port of Kribi, the Chinese stake is 66%. In Togo's port of Lome, it's 50%. Whoever controls a port controls what comes in, what goes out, and who sets the price of moving it. Is that partnership, or is it something closer to leverage? The pattern doesn't stop at the coastline. Walk into almost any mobile phone shop on the continent, and you're standing inside China's other empire, the one made of fiber cables and cell towers instead of concrete. Huawei alone built an estimated 70% of Africa's 4G networks, half of the continent's 3G systems too. Its closest rival for the rest of that market isn't an American or European firm. It's ZTE, another Chinese company. Between the two of them, they don't just sell equipment, they quietly decide what Africa's internet runs on. The clearest example of what's really at stake sits underground. In the southeastern Democratic Republic of Congo. In the town of Kolwezi, in a region packed with copper and cobalt, 2 Chinese state companies, Sino Hydro and China Railway Group, struck a deal with Congo's national mining company, Geka Mines. The arrangement was simple on paper. China would build roads, hospitals, and infrastructure worth $3 billion. In return, it would take a 68% stake in the copper and cobalt mine known as Sicomines. Minerals for infrastructure, no cash needed up front. But years later, Congo's own government looked at the numbers and didn't like what it saw. A government report concluded the country had not been fairly compensated for handing over some of the richest cobalt reserves on Earth, the very metal that powers electric car batteries and smartphones around the world. Congo's president, Félix Tshisekedi, called the original deal poorly negotiated. He pushed back, and in 2024, he won. The Chinese companies agreed to more than double their infrastructure commitment from $3 billion to $7 billion. It's a case study in what happens when an African government renegotiates from a position of strength instead of quietly accepting the first offer. Here's the twist most headlines miss. Outside of that fresh FOCAC pledge, China's day-to-day lending to Africa isn't accelerating, it's slowing down. In 2024, new loan commitments outside the summit pledge dropped to just over $2 billion, spread across only 6 projects continent-wide. Compare that to the boom years of the previous decade, when Chinese state banks were signing off on tens of billions a year for highways, power plants, and telecom towers. So why the slowdown? Because some of that earlier lending didn't pay off the way Beijing expected. Zambia defaulted on its debt in 2020, much of it owed to Chinese lenders, and spent years negotiating a painful restructuring. Angola, historically the single largest recipient of Chinese financing on the continent, has spent years repaying its debts partly in oil, shipping crude to Chinese refineries instead of cash. Beijing noticed. So the strategy is shifting. Fewer massive government-to-government loans, more targeted investment, more financing routed through African commercial banks instead of state deals signed behind closed doors, more funding aimed at small and medium businesses instead of single mega projects. It's a quieter kind of influence. But is it still influence? Critics in Washington and Brussels have a name for the old model. They call it debt trap diplomacy, the idea that China deliberately overlends to strategically important countries, knowing some won't be able to repay, so it can seize the asset later. Chinese officials reject that framing entirely and point out that most of Africa's total external debt is still owed to Western bondholders and multilateral lenders, not Beijing. The honest answer sits somewhere in between. China didn't need a secret plan to end up owning ports and mines. Standard commercial loan terms, enforced strictly when a government falls behind, can produce the same result. What does all of this actually mean for the people living across the continent? It means the roads they drive on, the ports their goods pass through, the networks their phones connect to, and increasingly, the mines beneath their feet all carry a foreign stake in the outcome. It means African governments now hold real negotiating power, as Congo proved, if they're willing to use it, instead of assuming the first number on the table is the final one. And it means the next chapter of this relationship won't be written in Beijing alone. It will be written in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Kinshasa, wherever the next contract gets signed, and by whoever reads the fine print before they sign it. A president once stood at a podium in Beijing and called it generosity. Look closer, and you'll see it was never really about aid. It was always about who ends up owning Africa's future.
If you like this story and want to know more about the companies, entrepreneurs, industries, scandals, and business empires shaping the African continent, hit like and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.